Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and as always, I'm joined by Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing? You okay?
I am doing fine. I'm Julian Darius. Why would you question that?
Well, at this point, I probably wouldn't. But let's see if your opinions match up with what I'm expecting, and then we'll get into it. Today we're going to be talking about, is it a precursor to sort of Invasion of the Body Snatchers?
Yeah, I looked it up, and yeah, it is. It's like 2-3 years before I think the first Invasion of the Body Snatchers is what, 57, and this is 53?
Yeah, so we're talking about the 1953 film, It Came from Outer Space, which I'd never seen before, and actually was very different to what I was expecting of a 1950s. What I was expecting to be like an invasion film, and it sort of is and isn't. It's a it's a surprising film.
It kind of has it both ways, right? Because it's like you get the. I thought that this was a blend of Invasion of the Body Snatchers because they impersonate humans, and The Day the Earth Stood Still, which is one of my favorite sci-fi movies. I grew up with it, and that's like 51, I think. So, and that's really different in that it's an invasion, but it's an invasion that's not that's benevolent, right?
Yeah.
And so here you find out, spoilers, right? This is really set apart from other 50s movies by the fact that the aliens, ultimately they're not here on a mission like in The Day the Earth Stood Still, but they're benevolent. They're not the bad guys. But you do spend half the movie with them like possessing people or taking their shape and apparently killing them.
Yeah. We'll go through the plot in a minute, but even the way it's filmed, like they are, the shots are all like set up to make them, or at least make the viewer see them as an enemy, as an invading sort of like force. It's and then you get it's that Twilight Zone-esque, isn't it? That here's the twist of sort of like you thought you were watching this, but you're watching something else. But the story is relatively simple, really. John Putman and his girlfriend, I think, Ellen Fields, living in this small sort of like desert town. He's an amateur astronomer. They're watching the skies and they see what they believe to be a shooting star or a meteorite crashing to Earth. And when they go to investigate it, he sees that it's not a meteorite but a ship, and he sees inside the ship. And unfortunately, due to a landslide, the ship is then covered, and everyone thinks he's talking rubbish. That he's seen a ship, until they start to see that people in the town, or at least a couple of people, are not acting themselves, and they're all changing into boiler suits for some reason. And then following this, a small group do believe him, and they go back to sort of engage or confront the inhabitants of the ship peacefully, predominantly. But unfortunately, the sheriff of the town is the gun-toting sort of villain of the piece and does not want to confront them on the peaceful terms, and is there with what's tantamount to a lynch mob, really. And it ends with a final confrontation and the ship leaving Earth. That's it in a nutshell, really. But I mean, what were your thoughts of this film overall before we start?
Yeah, that sheriff is not Sheriff Joe Arpaio, just so you know.
Yeah.
I thought I also thought of the Twilight Zone one. Like if Forbidden Planet is a proto Star Trek, this could very easily be a 1 hour. I mean, it's funny. This is an hour and 20 minutes. It feels a little long, especially in the beginning. It could easily have been a double 2-part Twilight Zone episode. And not just because it's black and white, but it does have that kind of twist, and it is about ideas. I really like this. I was surprised how much I like this better than the previous one. And, I thought this was, we'll give the ratings at the end. But, for me, this was a solid 6, like Star Wars, like up there with, it's a good Twilight Zone episode. I'd be happy with it as a Twilight Zone episode. It gets better as it goes on. What did you think?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that, but it gets better as it goes on. I remember when I was watching it, and it has this sort of like, slow burn narration to open it up, and then the story sort of gets through, and you meet the characters. It's a bit like here's so and so, here's so and so, and I mean that's not to say it takes forever to start. Like, it doesn't, but that first 10 minutes feels longer than 10 minutes because you're a bit like, oh, so something's going to happen. Oh, okay. And then when it does, though, it's sort of it's a relatively slow burn, but it gets good. It's better, and there's some good. The tone of this film is interesting. I enjoyed sort of how they do play with it, and so some of the commentary towards the end is ahead of its time, maybe, and maybe they didn't intend it to be commentary. I don't know. But when they say things like, you find out the reason that they sort of use these, the pod people style, they don't inhabit, they literally replicate. They are replications of these people they take hostage. And they say, like, because you can't accept us for what we look like, and all of a sudden I'm like, no, well, to be fair, like, okay, you can read into all kinds of ways. However, they're like 7 or 8 feet tall with a single eye, and they seem to float along. They're probably right, even now. But yeah, no, I really enjoyed this. It was a really surprising film. So I thought it was going to look a bit of a B movie kind of 50s fun fest, but no, there's definitely more to it.
Yeah, and I think it kind of starts out that way. I mean, it has that sort of narration, which is fine. But then it cuts to this, sort of your initial impression of this astronomer and his wife, or wife-to-be girlfriend, is, it's like a parody of a 50s housewife, yes. I want to cook for you and make you happy kind of thing. And it seems so melodramatic, and it feels like, oh, this is that part, like, the last movie we did was a sort of disaster movie. This is that setting up the characters for the plot. I don't care, and it's the most cliched nonsense. It's shot well, although this movie has the problem of oftentimes the shots and after cuts aren't matched very well. Yeah. So, the shots are beautiful in and of themselves, but, there's a kind of like staginess to the sets and to the shots. So I think it kind of like starts as a B movie, it's like, okay, now there's a rock slide. And then there's all this thing of like seeing these aliens in the road, and the car seems to pass through them. And this happens multiple times. You were talking about the way they're depicted as a threat. There's so much screaming in this movie. Yeah.
When you say about stage scream as well, I love. I have a real thing for this sort of like this era. This thing of sort of like of standing still and screaming at something, and then usually fainting. It's it's a very specific style.
It's fun though.
It is, yeah.
I do think that, by the end, it's a very different movie. And you were talking about the message of not only what they look like, but also this deeper message of that is sort of Star Trek of like, yeah, we'll meet again someday, but you're not ready for us. We know lots of stuff that you don't. You're very violent. And it's true. Humans are dumb, violent animals. We are not ready for contact like this.
Yeah, there's a great bit at the end where it's strangely not anti-human, this film, but like even the hero, played by Richard Carlson, this John Putman, he at the end sort of meets up with the aliens. He gets past his barrier, so he's able to sort of to speak to them, and he's being chased by this armed mob. And the aliens are just like, well, he's carrying a gun on himself, and then he's like, no, look, we can do this. You need to be able to. We want to help and do this other stuff, and they're like, yeah, but you're not ready, and you're clearly coming, and like I say, you're violent. And he's like, yeah. He even says something, but you've got this like ray thing that they're using, I think, to energize the ship or to that sort of thing. He's like, you can turn that on them, and I like the way the alien stops and thinks about it. Is like, that's your approach, yeah. That's not what we're about, sort of thing. And it's interesting that sort of even the hero ends up falling into that sort of the thing of like, well, retaliate with violence.
Yeah, it's a little strange though. Like I found that whole dynamic strange because although I like it, what it's trying to say. First of all, there's already been violence when he goes to the caves, right? Yeah. So there's already been the killing of an alien. So when he goes to the caves, he's got a gun, and the aliens are like, yeah, we don't want to do violence, but and they try to trick him. The one impersonating his girlfriend tries to trick him into stepping into a crevasse, which I liked. It's a sort of, and then when that doesn't work, there's a gunfight, with a ray gun, which just looks really awesome as it's cutting through the rock, but also is sort of like, you have the slowest arm of any sophisticated intelligence in the cosmos. They don't get in a lot of fights, so, they don't need to move that gun very fast. So, it seems like the aliens are then ready to commit violence. Then he suggests like, they're like, oh, all right, well, we're going to just blow ourselves up, including killing these hostages. Mm-hmm. And then, the astronomer suggests, well, why don't you free the hostages? Because you can just blow yourselves up anyway. And they're like, oh yeah, never thought of that. and I was like, why did you take hostages? I guess the point is to hide them while you impersonate them. But it seems, there's
no debate.
It's a little convoluted.
It's a little too convoluted or not convoluted enough. Like there's no debate of them saying, well, we can't let them go and we can't let you go because you've seen us now. Like you have now seen our technology. Like you like say the Earth isn't ready. We need to sort of kill you off or stop you from spreading this word. Like in that case, it could be the sort of close encounters approach of, well, come with us. I don't know, but yeah, it does seem easily resolved towards the end. But I mean, the one thing I was unclear about is the aliens. Did they crash land, or is it? It's an unintentional landing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They said there was an error, and it's this. It's also the explanation is this stereotypical thing of like, well, we weren't going to Earth. We arrived here by accident and crashed. Okay, planets are really far away in space.
I'm big.
Right?
I'm big. Like, yeah.
Like, we were heading to Tau Ceti, and we just were passing the Earth. This is not a thing that would happen.
I was heading to Greece, but I stopped in Italy. It's no. That's not how that works. It's it's a completely different place. Yeah, it's a bit of a like I say contrived excuse, but the other thing is there's a lot of that in this thing of, and again I think when you watch these films, I found it with the last one, and I think we'll find it again. We are much more sophisticated as an audience, and we have been given information through films and through just normal education, that when you watch something from the 50s, you have certain baggage that comes with that, and some of that is when a spaceship crashes to Earth. First, it's a big spaceship, like it's not small, and it hits with a bit of a bang. I'd be like, that's gonna have done way more damage than it did in the film. But more than that, like he gets close to him, like that's come through our atmosphere. We've seen it on fire. It should be hot. It should be carrying an awful lot of radiation. But he's quite comfortable going, nah, I'm all right. I'll pop down and have a look at it, and I'll tell you. But I'll come back and tell you what it's like.
Yeah, I thought about that, especially at the end with those hostages, all leaving, and it's like, oh, we're happy now. See, it's like, well, you gotta have been exposed to something. I will say that the movie does know both of those points, right? It does mention, it mentions radiation when they're first inspecting. Actually, when other people come to inspect the site, and say, well, there's no evidence there's a UFO here. If there were some kind of ship, wouldn't you find some sort of radiation? And there's not. And multiple times they talk about how, wouldn't they have a concussion from, there's this discussion of that. I'm totally willing to say this is advanced technology. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know I'm totally willing to go with that. It does look like almost like a little like geodesic dome, in design, which is kind of cool and abstract and looks a little cheap on film, but it's still like a cool abstract concept. But I can go along with a sort of like, well, we've got dampeners that would make us survive.
Yeah, and that's fair. I mean, again, you mentioned the ship. The ship's basically a sphere, and I do kind of like the design of it. Again, because it's one of those things that when you get up close, obviously they're limited by technology and budget for the film, but it's a good looking idea, and I love the fact, like you say, the door is just this one section that sort of sucks in and then comes back. Yeah, I'm quite, and with the alien as well, to be perfectly honest. I like the fact that this whole thing is about the way they look, and so they haven't gone for sort of like some sort of like bipedal. They haven't gone down the Star Trek route of going, having well, we're not human, we are Klingon, so I have to wear a headband to hide my ears or something. I'm Klingon, so I've got to hide my head, or Vulcan to hide my ears.
Forehead prosthetics.
Yeah, they haven't gone basic. Like, no, they've created a full on, alien-looking alien, which I think you and I have talked about before. This idea of like, no, they wouldn't look like us. This is a completely different biology, and I like the fact that they've done that, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, that is really cool. And they sort of remind me. They're shot sort of vaguely, so you don't see, how cheap it looks. And then, I was a little disappointed that we don't see more of them. Even if it's obliquely, because that final confrontation is just with a bunch of humans standing around. And, and you're like, okay, I know there are these weird aliens in human form, but, in a way that's cheaper, right? We haven't even bothered to put on the prosthetics because, but they kind of look like, sort of like they remind me of like the Quintessons from Transformers, the movie, sort of like egg-shaped, but sort of it's black and white, so they're sort of white and ethereal with one cyclopean eye in the middle. I don't get how they go through those cars, and why was there blood on that car when they keep confronting these humans and kidnapping them, and they say, "Don't worry, you'll be okay." I don't know. I'm a little confused by. I guess they're intangible.
Well, I almost took it as they're able to become intangible, because it's never really explained how they take on human form, because it's not like they don't inhabit the human. They don't take the human and then sort of like possess them. They literally replicate them. So they must have some sort of, either it's a technology or a capability to morph or do something. And when the car goes off the road, like you say, the two main characters are sort of like driving and they go through it. I take it, it's almost like that. Instead of it being intangible, I almost took it as they're trying to show like the morphing, like it's not solid, which is how it's able to take the human form. But yeah, it's a little confused because, like I said, they do have the sort of the blood on it, and then they also show like the blood on the rock, and obviously that's supposed to be the human blood, and so it's never really defined. But yeah, I kind of I'm digging all that though. If I'm perfectly honest, I'm like everything with the aliens. I'm like, no, I'm really sort of I'm into this. The fact that they're weird, the fact it's not explained, the fact that like it's not coming up with some. One of the things that really bugs me at times is, especially because I like details. What I'm like. I'll be sort of going, well, I want an explanation for this. However, if it is something like this, like First Contact, I don't want some scientist sort of like doing a little bit of analysis and going, well, they're silicon based and they can do all this stuff, and all of a sudden having an explanation for everything they can do. I like the fact that like they're just they are alien.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're never really into, you know, we don't get anything about the way that their hierarchy works. We don't understand how anything really sort of sets up, how they work. But I'm just digging it all that they are weird and alien and strange, and you know, which makes them more of a threat. Which is why when they're perceived as a threat, I understand. You know, the film keeps telling you these things are going to, you know, you don't realize they're replications that they're taking hostage. You don't know what's happened to the people that have gone missing at first. So I'm really I'm digging this idea that the film's not telling you a great deal, which seems a bit not ahead of its time, but seems, you know, for a sci-fi movie of early 50s, like, it seems quite daring, really.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, I like what you're saying, and I think the sort of like not saying a lot, it also, in retrospect, makes it age a lot better, because most 50s movies will have some pseudoscience, and you're like, yeah, we don't have that technology now to just like, you know, hold a tricorder up and say like, you know, they're clearly carbon based or, you know, silicon based or whatever. Yet you'll see that kind of stuff in other 50s movies where, you know, somebody's using something like that. So I think that helps it age a little better, but it also makes it feel more like a Twilight Zone episode in the sense that that's more realistic. You know, at the time, they can test for radiation and you know, they can measure radiation and say it's not there. But yeah, you know, they're not going to. If you have a primitive society encountering, you know, Star Trek level technology, especially weird aliens, right, and a weird ship, they're not gonna make heads or tails of it. I mean, it's the equivalent of like showing the microchip to Cro-Magnon, you know. The Cro-Magnon's not going to hold up a rock and go, see, for narrative purposes, I'm aware this is a silicon microchip. Processing technology.
Yeah.
Subtitles.
Yeah. No, and I do like that they remain alien, and their sort of motivations remain alien, like remain mysterious for the, you know, the majority of the film. The one thing I find interesting though is when they do replicate or morph or whatever they do to take on their human form, and they've got these two guys that they're sort of, you know, they're two sort of like farmers or whatever, and they go into town. Well, firstly, they're now both wearing boiler suits, which seems like you know, so they've replicated the person but not their clothes. Apart from the hat, one of them has a hat that he carries, but not their clothes, which I find really bizarre. And then I'm never entirely sure like why they knew to go into town. Like, you know, I'm going to. So they're looking for parts. Are they? What are they looking for in town? That seems.
Yeah, I mean, it seems as if they're looking for parts to repair their spaceship, but it's another thing that just sort of they show don't tell. They don't really reveal what it is. I was confused by their initial encounter because first we see the main two characters. They leave the site and they encounter this alien on the road, right? And then we see another unrelated couple encounter the alien, you know, unrelated two guys encounter the alien on the road, and they scream and, you know, they're apparently killed, and then we see them sort of replaced. And it later becomes clear that they had a car filled with electronic equipment, you know, that they were like repairmen or something. And then their replacements go into a store to buy electronics. And so you think, oh, they must be making repairs. I don't know how that works, right? You know, oh, you know, we're going to go to Circuit City. See, we're going to repair our alien spacecraft. You know, that's how you do. It's very bizarre, but you know, it is what it is. I mean, they can do amazing things with those parts and turn them into sophisticated things before they plug them into weird.
And I'm sure that's what it is. I mean, that's how I took it, and it's fine for the film. It works, you know, as a narrative. But if anything, it's almost irrelevant
Mhm.
because what the whole point is to drive this underlying fear, isn't it? That as Invasion of the Body Snatchers, it's this idea of, well, it's the people you know, but it's not the people you know. And like you say, I instantly make that sort of comparison to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and I know that whether it's what day of the week it is, there's that comparison to like, well, it's the whole thing around the Red Scare and all that kind of thing. And whether or not that is applicable to this, I mean, like I say, it's 53, but it definitely has that thing of sort of because you're not told anything, and it's light-hearted, but probably it's the 50s. It's not dark and gritty, it's not going to have anything, but there is definitely a fear or uncomfortableness of this film of you're not how as a viewer we know because you've got visual cues to identify the aliens and the alien replicas. But there's also this thing of like they have conversations and people are like, well, they're being a bit weird.
Yeah.
Jeff's being a bit weird today. So there is this thing of like,
did you don't you think they'd be pretty easy to identify? I mean, that's why I was doing the joke at the beginning. Like, something's wrong with Julian. Right?
Yeah.
Like
Julian's never worn a boiler suit before, and he seems to be talking a bit funny. Like
talking very slowly.
Mm.
I did like one of the cues, which was the guy staring. He says, "Oh yes, the sun is beautiful," and he's just staring into the sun.
Yeah.
That was cool.
But like you said, yeah, they're not hard to spot. But again, it's that thing as well, though, of he knows it. The main character, that John Putnam, he knows it, but it's trying to convince others, and it's that thing of like even if you can see that they're weird, to the explanation, it's that thing, isn't it, of saying, well, it's not them; they've been replaced, and straight away you just go, well, you're not talking sense. He tries to explain it to the sheriff and to a few others, and everyone's just like, yeah, whatever. Like you clearly, you've been at the source again.
Yeah. It's not the most. I mean, who's going to believe that, right? It's not the most obvious. Occam's razor would, prohibit.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that's funny is this conversation about science, right? That and how I love how science is presented in different movies. And here I'm thinking of when the people from the university come out and are inspecting the now buried spacecraft, and it's logic right out of Ed Wood, as he says to the scientist, like, what does he say? It's like, we used to think,
the Earth was flat.
that the Earth was flat, and there were two mountains on either side, and those held up the stars that dangled like pinwheels, and then somebody came up with a better idea, and it's like, not exactly. This is not exactly, and it's like, I'm not sure how, like, you're describing the scientific method like for babies.
Mm-hmm.
That's so often abused in a way that people say like, well, science is open to revision, so you should be open to the idea that the global warming isn't real, and 100,000 scientists have conspired to hide the evidence. No, I'm not open to that, you lunatic. So there is a kind of like naivete to that presentation of science.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I do quite like that scene as well. Like you say, when he says about, we used to think this, and now we, it's that phrase, isn't it? Someone came up with a better idea, and it's not. It's in a really small nutshell. Not, we gained new information and interpreted it in a new way and all this other stuff. Like, no, someone came up with a new idea and everyone went, yeah, that sounds better.
Right. And little did they know that the idea that the Earth was flat and just held up by two mountains at the end was in fact correct.
Yeah.
We've got to go back to that idea.
Yeah, it's clearly right. I'm sat here and I can see the world is flat just from out the window in front of me.
Smart.
No, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not going to take all those decades and hundreds of years of scientific knowledge as fact.
You know for a fact. I don't know. It's like Bill Maher says, like, I don't know this. I don't know it for a fact. I just know it's true. Okay. There is going to be on the Amazon listing for this movie, somebody's going to say, I give this movie 5 stars, except that it purports that the earth is round.
Yeah.
And, warning, anti-science warning.
As they like to refer to it, the globalist conspiracy, which I'm still not entirely sure what is the objective of this globalist conspiracy. To this narrative of the world is flat. One day we will get to a film where we can really get into the whole idea of flat Earth, because it just baffles me. But that's a different film. But I do like this idea. One of the ideas of this film, which coming from a film in the 50s, and maybe I've got, I don't, my history of the 50s is very sort of bullet point, especially in American history. But this idea of it being open to change, this idea of them saying, like, look, we know this now, and we will see things differently in the future. Like, we should be open to that, is interesting. And it is quite an open film. Like, your main protagonist is of that ilk, isn't he? Like, even at the end, like, yeah, he is human. He carries a gun. It's all sort of, it just sort of come down to violence. But he's still saying, like, look, I'll help you. Give me the hostage. I'll help you so you can get out. Like, I'm open to working with you. It has like a really positive approach to this thing. Instead of just going, alien, shoot it. It's all about, look, I'll work with you. I'm happy. This is an amazing discovery. Tell me more.
Right. And while not the sort of progressive masterpiece that The Day the Earth Stood Still, it's still in that. It's still doing that. And you're quite right. It manages to have its sort of gunplay. It has its conflict. It has those moments. But ultimately, it's not resolved violently. It's resolved by blowing up a mine, entrance conveniently. Like, hey, grab that there dynamite. But it is true that not only is it resolved ultimately non-violently, but it's resolved by the protagonist becoming the champion of the aliens against humanity and humanity's violent instincts. And having seen the light, I do love that scene where he convinces the alien to show his true form. And he says, like, I need to see this. And they're like, don't say we didn't warn you, Yeah. And he seems like sort of a little shell-shocked afterwards.
Can I say about that, though? Yeah, because he does, because he turns away, doesn't he? In that sort of like, kind of way. But do you think we would ever do that as humans? If we went into space and we land on the planet and we were like, no, you can't see us as we really are. We'd be like, no, look at us. Perfection of humanity. We are 2 legs, 2 arms. Hey, well balanced. Like, it seems like an odd thing to the idea of not being able to blend in, to not be identified, to do it as a form of disguise makes sense. But for a species to see itself and go, no, we're hideous. Like, you don't want to see us, because that's sort of how it comes across a little bit. Seems bizarre to me.
I didn't take it that way. I took it as you would see us as hideous. That they're just wise enough to say, like, you would repel from us. And even though it's heavy-handed, I like that bit with the spider of sort of like, what would you do if that spider came close? And just casually destroying it. Right. You kill what you don't understand. You are scared of what you don't understand. And so I think that the aliens are just intelligent enough to know that they would be perceived that way, and that these humans are violent. And if they look at you and say, what the hell is this monster thing that's got these superpowers? Let's, just to be on the safe side, let's exterminate all of them. Because that's the human history, right?
Yeah. Two things. That scene with the spider, I was baffled by the fact that they chose to have a special effects like a rubber spider.
Yes.
Rather than just picking up a spider to put in a scene, which would have been 10 times easier. But still,
Especially because they don't even show it being stepped on. Not that anyone would have cared about stepping on a spider in 1953 on film. I mean, you still had horses being thrown off cliffs in some cases, Yeah, that I thought that was. There's also a shot of a spider that's clearly a live spider earlier in the movie, and it's such an obvious rubber spider, like on a thread.
I do wonder if they tried to film a live spider and they were just like, it's not working and we haven't got time. Go buy a rubber spider from a joke shop. But yeah, the other thing is, you are right about this idea, and it's perpetuated throughout. Not like I say, our history. We'll get into this idea of the unknown, but even on film, like it's just become the go-to, for family films. Think of like E.T. The end of E.T. is literally this whole thing of the government chasing down, because they don't know it. The X-Files is pretty much based on this idea of the unknown being the bad. So yeah, it's in sci-fi and horror, it's always been that way. That's there. And I think really it's probably only been in the last couple of years where we're now being introduced to this idea. And I don't want to sort of incur any wrath in this, but really the films, when you think about, I mean, Star Trek started it. This idea of working alongside, not just different races but different species and all this other thing. It's probably become more and more of a thing now. But you can see it's become so part and parcel now that. Not just Star Trek, but Guardians of the Galaxy or any other sort of space thing. It's just like, oh no, the team is made up of different species, and we're cool with that. And I think that's just becoming the norm now. But this idea in this about our automatic violence towards the unknown. This is 1953. So. My go-to really is like, okay, is this trying to make a civil rights statement, or is there something else? I didn't. I was trying to think of I was trying to think of American history from this point really, and you've got the Cold War. So is it sort of suggesting about is it to do with the Red Scare? Is it to do with civil rights? Because the civil rights didn't really start till 55. That sort of thing. So yeah, I don't know. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the civil rights movement, of course, there were, civil rights protests and stuff throughout history and including in the teens. Yeah. But the civil rights movement, as we classically think of it, I think, what is it? It's really starts kicking off later. McCarthy has already run his thing, right? He's done. Mm-hmm. But he's been really exposed, but we're still Cold War and there's still paranoia. Obviously, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is, 3 years later. It's 56, not 57, like I said earlier. But it is widely seen as an anti-communist film, right? Mm-hmm. They can look like you, right? It's not like those black people who look different, right? Yeah. Or those Indians, right, who look different. Communists are white, and they can convert you. But in that film, it's seen as an anti-communist propaganda. I think what's interesting about this film is, if anything, this is pro-cooperation, not pro-communist, but pro-cooperation propaganda, which I think is much bolder. And I think it's a brave statement. I think anything that here, if you think about this in the context of American history at the time, it is a brave statement to say, they're not, you're scared. You feel the need to arm yourself against this threat. And it is a threat that has been built up. The American government built it up. Senators ran for re-election, claiming, that that there's bomber gap and a missile gap. All of this nonsense. They're going to invade us. They're going to overcome us. And in fact, Russia was a weak country compared to us. But we built them up and we're really terrified. And here they are more sophisticated, but they're not waiting to get us. They're not just, and it did make me think. I found myself thinking, and I don't know what specifically in the film prompted me, but thinking about that I was going to talk to you about it, I find myself thinking that both of us are in colonial countries.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, it reminded me of some of the points that Malcolm X made about, white fear of blacks rebelling because that's what whites would do if they had put up with half as much. That sort of when you're in a colonizing country, your experience is that you went to this country and took what you wanted and weren't all that nice about it, and even if you tried to be nice on the edges, you knew your point there was exploitation. And so I think that's related to the xenophobia in both of our countries, as we think, well, if Pakistanis or Hispanics are coming here, they must be coming here to exploit us. No, that you just assume that nobody ever travels anywhere except to exploit people.
We went all over the place and treated everyone like crap, so they must be coming here to do the same to us.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think so in terms of the communist setting, if anything, this is saying think a little more globally. There are opportunities to cooperate and don't assume violent intent. So I think that's a pretty radical thing.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, weirdly, it made me think of it just sort of popped in my head towards the end of the film. It's like Pocahontas, the Disney film Pocahontas. It's almost been like the antithesis of this, of that sort of thing. Of you say the colonialism, like in this, the aliens they're here by accident. They could quite easily go, yeah, we're here by accident, but you know what? Oof, your resources or whatever, this bit of real estate you've got here is pretty good, isn't it? I think we'll have some of that. But there's that mentality is not there at all. It's not like these ends are not an invading force. They're not there as I say to colonize or anything like that. Steal our resources. And so it is sort of against it. When you sort of I thought of Pocahontas mainly because I recently watched it with my daughter on the Disney Channel. And that thing again of just sort of the invading force, whether it be the British or the Spanish or whoever coming over to find that resource, and the native people, the indigenous people, then sort of being exploited and stuff. And I was like, this film could have easily gone there. And that's sort of what it suggests at the beginning, isn't it? That's where the film sort of, that's the fear that it's stoking in you. This thing of like, they're either possessing or replicating people. They came in a more advanced ship. The tone of the film when you see it sort of like as you say, sort of intangible, the car going through it, and all this stuff is them being better or more sinister, and the whole film is setting you up to think, yeah, they are the baddies and they're here for a purpose. And so it does, yeah, and that was in my head the whole time. I was like, and I didn't see the ending coming. I was like, oh, this is going to be a combative ending. And again, I think it's because I'm programmed with that in my head. That of course they're here with, maybe my innate xenophobia coming through in a pop culture way. But I was like, yeah, of course they're here with negative, for invasion purposes. And when it turns out they're like, no, we just
you'd be
down.
The sheriff.
Seriously, there'd be a part of me that probably would. I would like to think I'd be the scientist that's going, no, all right, I'm going to help you out. But there's a part of me that would also be like, and especially from a small town, it's very telling that they do small town, desert based. It's isolated. It is a small town America. They're trying to say something there. But yeah, I don't know. Would I? I would like to think I'd be the better person, but I couldn't guarantee that. And this film probably says I probably wouldn't. I'd be like, I'd grab my pitchfork and that's it.
Well, I like the idea that they crash and then they're like, oh, this is a good place to colonize, Well, we did land here by accident, but now that we've taken the shape of your women, we want your women, Mars needs women.
Sorry, I was going to say Mars Attacks was another one that crossed my mind watching this film. And we'll get to that in a minute, but you're right about sort of...
Right,
yeah.
we come in peace.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I did think... No, I mean, I do think that I would be the professor, and I would think like, look, what's going to happen is going to happen. If they're going to kill me in the cave, they're going to kill me in the cave. Maybe I'll take a gun to defend myself just in case, which for some reason seems to work on them. But probably I don't have a lot of chance against these guys. On the other hand, I get to talk to aliens. Like, let's go talk to them and see what the worst thing that happens is they kill me. You know, they're probably going to zap me with a laser and I'm not going to feel a thing and I'll be dead. It's not like the way we normally die, which is slow and agonizing. That's actually a really good way to die. It's about the best way possible because you get killed seeing an alien, being the first among the first humans to ever see an alien. That's worth a quick death. And that's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is like, hey, they're cool and I get to be friends with an alien. That sounds pretty awesome to me. Yeah, there is that moment when he comes out of the mine shaft, which I don't know where that mine shaft is, you know, compared to this crash site. It's just like, oh, by the way, there's a mine shaft nearby. I mean, I guess it's you think like it's an abandoned mine shaft because it's not still being worked on. There are no workers taken prisoner. And yet at the same time, it's active enough to still have dynamite laying around near the entrance.
Yeah. I was going to say, that's what I liked. Just 4 sticks of dynamite tied together about 4 feet in front of the entrance.
I mean, in fairness, I have 4 sticks of dynamite next to the entrance of my house. You know, it's a thing we do over here. But, you know, so coming from a small town myself, I mean, I'd be that guy. But there is that wonderful moment when he comes out and he talks to the sheriff, and the sheriff says, like, yeah, how do you know they haven't lied to you? They've captured people. They've taken their shape. There's blood. There's lots of reasons to be suspicious of them. And you as a viewer go, oh, gee, I don't know. You know, like I can't prove anything here. Ultimately, but it's that thing about like, you know, the dead man switch, right? And the times when somebody has prevented, you know, really single-handedly prevented global thermonuclear war because they didn't want to be the one to do it. You know, like, I am not going to be the one to call this in or press the button that makes the world die by nuclear fire. And if the odds are decent that my country will be eradicated, you know, I'll take that chance. I'm not going to do this. And, you know, proverbially speaking, thank God for those people. But I think that's sort of like what I felt in those moments. And again, that's thinking globally. That's thinking as a species. You know, he's like, you know, I believe them, and I believe them at that point in the movie, but I don't know. But I'm not going to be the one to start shooting aliens just to be safe. You know?
Well, I suppose it comes down to a couple of things, doesn't it? Because you talk about this idea of you know, cooperation and collaboration. Well, part of that is trust. You know, you say, well, how do you know? Well, I'm having to trust them. I've shown them trust and hoping that they can reciprocate. That's the point of collaboration. But I say the other side of that as well is, you know, see about the species. This thing of, you know, like saying, well, you don't know that opening fire could escalate things. They might be sat there going, yeah, they were peaceful, and we want to leave. We don't really want to be here because, let's be honest, this town's shit. I want to go home. And all of a sudden they open fire, and they're like, look, well, we have no choice but. In order for us to leave, we've got to keep you at base and we've got to retaliate. And we've seen they've got the weapons to do it with the laser that burns through rock. So there's a part of me as well that was saying, look, if they're saying they want to leave, let's give them the opportunity, because the potential is, like you said, worst case, best case scenario. Best case scenario is they do leave. All right. And we then have a UFO story for this town, and we can open up all kinds of shops and we can get tourists in for it. Wonderful. Worst case scenario is you open fire and they kill us all.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if we're like a little later in cinematics history, right, you get to sort of the cynicism of, like, you know, the Alien franchise, where it's like, yeah, no, the best case scenario isn't that they leave, brother. The best case scenario is that We go in guns a-blazing, kill us some aliens, and then we have some aliens to dissect, and we have that technology for ourselves.
Yeah.
And, then just watch those comets with a good old USA flag emblazoned on them, USAF.
If you want to take that, there is the cynical ending, or there's a cynical version of this that says, how do you know they're not a scout ship? You letting them go means that more people know about this place. There's that thing. There's always that's come up in future films. I'm sure that's come up again. We can't let them go, because we don't want them to, or we can't show weakness, because if they think they can go, that means, and that might is right kind of approach will come up again and again in future films. But again, as you said, there's also the capitalist approach that says, well, or even Independence Day, or even Transformers, the first Transformers film. When they make a point of, we found Megatron in the ice, and then we basically reverse engineered a bunch of stuff, and they obviously, everyone talks about microwaves and stuff. Like, we reverse engineered a whole bunch of stuff off this. Like, how do you think you got your mobile phone? There's this idea, isn't there, of, as I say, of utilizing the technology, but that really doesn't. I suppose that that I'd be interested to find out when that first got introduced, or when that started to creep into films, because it's not really mentioned here. But the other thing we should mention in this film as well is, again, it's a small town. This film doesn't cover a long period of time, but there's a large absence of any military or government interference. This is a local film for local people. But that's what it is, isn't it? It's a local story. Like, again, I like those small stories. I like the fact that there is no. The sheriff doesn't sort of ring up, again, like he doesn't ring up the FBI there's no one there's no Men in Black sort of situation, or where the military turns up and like, we heard there's a ship and we're going to take it, or we saw a big big thermal flare on our sensors, unclear sensors, right. And so they turn up. Like, that's what happened now. That's how this would be portrayed. No, this is a small film. It's a small.
Yeah, I mean, they you'd think that there would have been some sort of, detection, but I mean, there are moments where you see like a bunch of Jeeps coming over to the site, and really that's just like a convoy led by that sheriff. Yeah. But it does feel, I did find myself thinking sort of, barely beneath my consciousness, oh, this is the Men in Black, right? This is the military response. But you're right, it's just not in there. And it is a smaller movie, and it does feel like, and I'm fine with this, I don't think it's a hit to say it feels like a extra long Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah. And again, I like that. I like the fact this is kept relatively small. It becomes like a town dispute. I can imagine that, years to come, this becomes a town legend. This is one of those things where kids will go out to this crater, and there'll be this, there's a UFO landed in this thing, and like, my granddad tells me about the night that they tried to stop the aliens taking off or whatever. I kind of like that this is just a small local story. Like, there is no big thing of like, take them, and we want to take the aliens or the technology and that. It's just a and also in 53, I can't imagine the local sheriff calling the FBI and going like, yeah, I believe what's happening here. Like, they'd be like, all right, thank you very much. Click. The one thing that I did sort of just popped into my head about this being a crash landing in this thing is, and then I mentioned to you before that we'd probably get onto this topic, is obviously Roswell happened in 6 years before this, and although it had died down, there was
it happened.
Okay, yeah.
Right. What I don't know what that means. Okay.
The Roswell incident, the alleged crashing of at least one ship in Roswell, New Mexico, happened in 1947, and there's obviously all the press around that, and that did go national because the Air Force reported several different stories during that time, and so this sort of being a crash landing in a desert town, again, sort of struck me in that way that, like, that this is clearly sort of tapping into that that idea of oh yeah, then that sort of still in the zeitgeist a little bit, and they were utilizing that a little bit in the fear of little green men or whatever you want to call them. That just sort of creeps into my head a little bit just then, actually, whilst I was thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I think it is, that's a good point that, this is, a sort of like riff on that in the sense that you could think, well, maybe some story is going to be circulated of like, obviously it's in the paper, like this, this guy claims that, although he's ridiculed, it's not the military put out a story, which they did at Roswell. Yeah, we got a flying saucer, and then retracted it. But, which is, to my mind, inscrutable and bizarre on all kinds of levels. But you can kind of see this as like, oh, what really happened is Roswell, except with a local sheriff instead of. Although, it's worth pointing out that, like, when one of the reasons why I know that, when Kennedy proposed going to the moon, one of the reasons why there was a lot of resistance to doing so was because in the scientific community, the idea of going to the moon was like, that's what they do in dumb sci-fi movies. And they were so hostile to that. So, I think that the majority of the population certainly didn't believe that, aliens were visiting us. But it was a thing that was, it was in people's minds. I mean, the idea of a crash is, from Roswell on, certainly is the sort of archetypal alien encounter.
Yeah, it just sort of struck me, especially it being an unnamed desert town. It just felt like that sort of atypical sort of idea of what they thought like a UFO crash would have been at that point. Interestingly, though, as you say, the design of the ship isn't atypical because the flying saucer, the disc shape, had already been. I think it was quoted in a news story in the late 40s. I'm remembering the book I read recently, the book I listened to. It was 48 or 49, and became this sort of idea. So everybody thought of it as the two saucers. The reason it came up because it was the idea of two saucers put together, one on top of the other, and so it became known as the flying saucer. But this isn't that. Like again, I think when we get to Earth versus the flying saucers, we'll see that. But yeah, the ship in this isn't again. I'm glad they used their imagination and went a different way rather than doing something a little bit. People. That's the thing with this film. Like a lot of the thing, it's not what you expect. You keep thinking it's going to be something, and it's not. And I was glad to be surprised by a film from 1953.
Yeah, and it's a solid movie. I mean, what you said about like how it wasn't what you expected. Yeah, I didn't think that. I mean, it's presented as people screaming, right, as they're absorbed or whatever. Yeah. And that proves not to be the case, and sort of the first hint of that is you've seen this arm behind the rock, and the main character assumes, oh, that's the other guy who's dead. And in fact, you find out, no, that's the guy who he's already seen. It's just the real version, and he saw an alien who had taken that guy's shape, and the other guy's still alive. So that sort of suggests, they are okay, and the alien tells them, you won't be harmed if you do what I say, right? Which still sounds vaguely menacing.
Yeah.
But I loved what you said about how even at the end, maybe this is a scout ship, and about trust. And I think that, we've talked before about how science fiction is able to get at important ideas and able to get at existential ideas about humanity and what kind of person we want to be, but really what kind of species we want to be. And, what I was saying about, I mean, if I'm going to die encountering an alien, fine. But I'm not going to be that guy who presses that button and ends the world, right? Or presses that button and is now responsible for killing the first aliens who landed here, right? We don't want that reputation. So, I mean, I like the idea that these encounters are ambiguous. And yeah, they flew away, but maybe you never know. And maybe some of that trust can't ultimately be earned. And it strikes me that in so many, you mentioned Independence Day, Transformers, in so many recent movies, the aliens have a bad motive, right? It's very rare that you see something like this in recent years, just because it's more fun, if nothing else. Maybe we're more cynical. I think that this is a lot deeper. I mean, it's not a masterpiece of a film, but it's a lot deeper in presenting not just the need to trust despite lingering ambiguity, and also the need to sort of think, without putting too much of a point on it, long term as a species. I'm not gonna initiate a conflict with aliens landing here, if I don't have clear evidence that they're of their hostile intent.
Well, again, it's that thing of like, why would you engage with something that's clearly more technologically advanced than you? Like, if they're not showing hostility, like you say, to run at it with spears and shields, it just seems, or even like what I always think of. There's a comment in Independence Day, which is a film we may or may not cover ever. But there's a comment in that when Will Smith sort of goes, when he finally gets into the airbase and they're talking about the ships over the place. You see it on the news, and he actually says sort of like over the news, "Please stop shooting your guns up in the air. Like, you're not doing anything, and you're actually endangering people." And I always think that's quite an interesting comment. Sort of like, even from a 1996, 97 sort of film. This idea of like, people are just opening fire in the street and pointing up and shooting with their handguns or their AR-15s or whatever they've got. And I'm like, that the first part of that film, like, you don't know what those ships are. They're massive and they're shown to be intimidating, but they just sat there. They're not doing anything to begin with. But everyone's instant response is open fire.
Scott, why do you hate America so much?
We would do it in Britain, but we don't have weapons, and it's quite hard to throw pitchforks that far.
Well, this is just liberal propaganda. My AR-15 is going to defend great when the military rolls through with tanks and stealth fighters, right? Let alone flying saucers. It's a bizarre thing. Only in America.
Yeah. Well, it's true, but one of the things, but this is clearly the American experience, though, isn't it? That's what this is tapping into. It's very much the American experience of the lone person, sort of like denouncing violence and saying like, no, let's use trust, let's use collaboration or cooperation for this one moment against an armed mob. But in this, at no point. The armed mob are never shown to be irrational. They're shown to be fearful, but at no point are they irrational. They don't know anything other than, people in our town have clearly been taken over.
Right.
People have gone missing, and we now know there's an alien ship here. Like, no, I would rather be armed and defend, or at least be on the attack. So it's never. We know it's daft as a viewer. But again, taking into consideration this is a small town, he is the law as well, so his job is literally to defend these people. They're never shown to be irrational, which I think is another point of saying, like, again, if this film was to come out at another point, at some point in the future, probably less so now, but if you did it in sort of the 80s or the 90s or early 2000s, that sheriff would be gung ho, guns are blazing. And it would be a lot more irrational response than
and he might be like a conservative stereotype, like he's like, he's got some shotgun on the wall with like he's got a name for it, and it's mounted, and he's like,
Me and
old
Bertha
Bessie,
are going to take on those aliens. Yeah.
Right. It's time to put you to use. Papa always said this day would come. I mean, but that gets back to this sort of humanism of sort of like I mean, the closest that sheriff gets to irrationality is that fight where he has to be restrained and he's just angry about, like, what are they doing? I don't have these reassurances. It's not really irrational. I mean, he's worked up, but that's as close as this goes. And I think that it's so important that there is no villain here.
Yeah.
Nobody is a bad guy. Everybody is understandable.
Yeah, they're just, I mean, again, it comes down to information. The aliens are like, well, you can't handle us in our current form. But you get this one guy who's like, you're probably right. And when they do show it, he is like, ew, But he's making an attempt to engage and discuss and form that communication channel. And in so doing, understands why they're here. But the police...
It's also a show of good faith, right? Because it's like, I want you to... I'm concerned that you're talking about trust. I'm concerned that you're concealing something. You admit you're concealing what you look like. So it's a show of good faith. Tell me or show me this thing that I'm not going to like hearing or seeing. Yeah. Right? That's important in all relationships. We have to say things that we know the other person doesn't like.
Yeah, and I think when you get to this, the sheriff, again, take into consideration his role in the town. Like, he's got to try and quell this, or at least he has none of this information. He just knows what he knows, and really, his training and everything is okay. Well, I've got to do it. I have the authority to enforce this, and so he's only doing his role. And like you say, he's not doing it out of malice or some sort of arrogance or even sport. Like, it's not that gung-ho moment of, like, where you'd see like a wall of like taxidermied animals and him like, I'm going to add an alien to my collection. It's nothing like that, though, is it? It's not played that way. So like you say, they're just different parties that just don't have information or do have information.
Yeah, we could write a sort of cliche alien invasion movie. It would be a lot of fun.
Yeah. But yeah, so I just find it interesting again that, like, maybe, I honestly thought that we'd go back to these 50s films and we'd be poking fun at, look at these rinky-dink effects and these sort of like these naive people from the 50s. And I'm finding that we're going, no, they were, apart from some, diversity issues that we blatantly point out, actually, they seem to have a better handle on things than we seem to at the moment in some cases.
Yeah, and they're doing what they're doing, and the sets, the money is limited, the special effects are limited, but these aren't dumb scripts. It is this script was originally written by Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury, and then the director like rewrote dialogue and whatever and got a co-credit. But this is freaking Ray Bradbury, wrote. I mean, this is serious stuff. It's it's good stuff. And I like that. I think that it's easy to sort of mock the 50s and mock, and definitely the number one thing the 50s deserves to be mocked about is the diversity. It is the sort of like, and this idea of just American goodness, in a dumb way. I mean, there are good things about America, but there are bad things about America. The thing that I never get over about the 50s is, every image of a diner where, it's not a black in sight. It's just the happy white kids. But I was thinking about, if this is an encounter, who do you encounter in the desert? Who did white people encounter as they went out and conquered the Southwest? Well, two groups, Native Americans, number one, and number two, Mexicans, that in fact, that whole territory was stolen from effectively. And here's an encounter between different people that doesn't have to end in violence, where, you think about how many encounters with Native Americans, in reality, often went peaceably, but there's this lack of trust. And when people have guns and lack of trust, bad things happen.
Yeah. Well, we this idea of escalation and stuff, like you say, not just in that thing, especially like say in those areas, disputed areas or areas of where there would be animosity anyway. It's going to happen, but you see it in communities now as well. I'm not just about gangs, and that's different, but escalation. I mean, especially now, this idea of like this diversity and the separation of groups, and not just because of the lack of information, but that lack of a desire to engage. I could get the information quite easily. I don't want to because I've got the information I want that suits my narrative, and so that's all I want. And again, this sort of challenges that, because it could quite easily be taken down that route of just going, well, I've got this story and that's what I'm sticking to it. Like, this film really wants to show you that thing of like, no. Listen, learn, try and, it's going to take a bit of trust, but you've got to get that additional information so that you can make a more informed decision. And I think that goes back to that idea they talk about. Yes, it's not articulated well, but this idea of the flat earth and then learning more. It's this idea of like, yeah, over time, you're going to ingest more information, and you've got to be open to changing your ideas and saying, yeah, well, I used to think this, but now I've learned stuff, and actually that wasn't quite right, and now I've got to think about it a different way.
I'm so glad to hear you say this, Scott, because I've got some Hollow Earth documentaries that I'm waiting to show you. And then when you're done with those, the 9/11 truther ones. But
well, if you're showing me those, then I'm going to show you with the reptilians and the royal family. It's mind blowing.
Are the royals reptilians?
They are, and if you watch the Oprah Winfrey interview, all the evidence is there in the way that Harry is sitting. And
well, if you think I'm
joking,
you count the. Oh yeah, is this a real thing?
Oh yeah. You can. I could find them on YouTube very quickly. Yeah.
God. Yeah. I love to pretend that this stuff. This is like, half the world. I can only survive by dimly being aware that it exists. And like abstractly, I know people like this exists. I don't really want to believe it, and I don't internalize that information. Yeah, it is very difficult. I was going to say that just to piggyback on what you were saying, that the fact that the main character not only has to trust and has to get this information and learn, but also that he has to take what's really like a last-ditch radical step of literally he has to physically prohibit his own people from going into that cave, because he knows they're the ones who can't listen to reason. He can't argue with them. He knows there's no hope of getting this armed mob. They're not totally irrational, but they're going to go into that cave and try to figure this out for themselves. He has to create this desperate physical barrier. And I think there's thinking about the sort of like dead man switch, there's a sort of like argument here for having that courage to stand up to power. Because he's standing up to that sheriff. This might not go well for him. He doesn't seem to be arrested at the end, but that sheriff could very easily arrest him even after the movie's over and just say, you have in fact obstructed a lawman in the course of his duties.
Yeah. I mean, there's a version of this film where, like you say, or even a post, like the end of this film, where he's dragged away. And again, I think there would be a version of this film later on if the military are involved or the FBI or something like that said, like, you've prevented this, or you've, and then he gets dragged away, sort of thing. And it's sort of that sacrifice is part of the story. But he does, and it's a double-edged sword though, because he's trying to prevent. He's obviously trying to let the aliens go, but in many ways he's trying to save their lives as well. By stopping them from going into that cave or confronting the aliens, like, with their rifles and whatever, like, he's like, no, they've got lasers, right? Yeah, like your poxy little hunting rifles and stuff ain't going to do squat, really. So, by creating that barrier, yeah, he's pissed them off, but he's also acting as he's technically saving. He's trying to save their lives as well, which is an interesting way of sort of presenting it.
Right, like presumably the aliens would just detonate their craft, and it's not clear like how big that explosion would be. Like presumably it wouldn't destroy the entire planet; it would just destroy this area and certainly kill them. And they make comments about not letting this technology fall, into the hands of humans. So clearly it would destroy the craft and the people there. So yeah, I mean, it's not going to go well for the sheriff.
No.
I was thinking in a way there's a like Jordan Peele version of this movie where it is more diverse, and the aliens find that they can wander around the town and nobody questions them despite stammering and everything. But they took the form of a black guy, and for some reason, everybody questions him and instantly, shoots him on sight when he acts weird. Yeah,
there's a slight comedy version of this. In fact, like I say, it'd be a sketch, wouldn't it? Where like there's 4 aliens, 3 of them white, 1 of them black, and the black one's the one that gets stopped, and the other 3 are like, I don't get it. Like, what? How have we got by this? Like, this alien culture looking at us and going, I don't understand this at all.
Right, and then the other 3 say, well, they do this sort of like the white invalidation thing of going like, well, what did you do to get stopped, fellow alien? We've all taken human forms. You must have done something different.
Let's assess this information. Let's assess like how this happened. Yeah, there's a way of doing it. It's an interesting, it'd be an interesting path to go down, really. But again, I say it is a very white town. I think they were never going to cross that line in 53. Maybe later. I mean, I'd be interested to see if we get to future films as we go down maybe not with this season, but later on, if we do come back and say, do you remember that? Should we watched it came from outer space and sort of have that a different thought on it? I mean, this idea of the alien trying to destroy the technology as well. It comes up again, and that's I mean, one of the most famous I can think of is Predator, and at the end of that. But that again is a human trait, because I know that during wars, if a more advanced army can't take it with it, it will destroy what it has to leave behind, whether it be guns and even in World War One. I know that if either the British or the German forces or whatever knew they were going to lose a trench or whatever, they would destroy defenses and guns and battlements to make sure that they couldn't be used against them and stuff. So in this idea of destroying stuff, it's sort of again common sense, I suppose, intergalactic common sense.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say that it's sort of like a human projection onto these aliens, that they would want to do that. But it does remind me of sort of like how this has become such a trope that aliens sort of, it's sort of like the Star Trek First Contact thing,
I say the
right?
Prime Directive, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, exactly that, of sort of like, don't screw with their culture. They're not ready for this.
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting thing, like I say, of as a human, we don't really care, because we'll land on an island and be like first contact, and we're like, don't care. Where's your gold? Where's your resources and minerals? We're taking them. But again, we do project that. Like obviously, Gene Roddenberry projected it into Star Wars, into Star Trek, and then we have another films where where aliens have said like, no, we cannot leave this behind. You're not ready. It is weird how we put ourselves in this boat, and it's we said about this humanist approach this film takes, but it happens. We either are the victorious force over a superior invading force, Independence Day or Mars Attacks or one of those, or we're sort of acknowledged as being this backwater sort of like not evolved yet planet, we seem to have this idea of being like, well, if these aliens are coming to us, then they're clearly more advanced. So we're like, we're the sort of the less evolved. Okay, yes, technologically, but there must be, it's a trope again, isn't it? This idea of like, you're not ready for this because you're not advanced enough. And at some point, are we going to reach a point where we go, as a human race, we are advanced enough now to accept this technology? Or is it always going to be a trope that we're going to have to deal with?
Well, I mean, I think it's objectively true that we're not, really ready for it. I mean, I still worry about nuclear war. I don't think, it's proven that the world isn't going to end in nuclear war. We've been very lucky for 70 years or so, but it's not at all clear that there won't be nuclear exchanges. And I think, in fact, the odds are pretty good. If you run the clock forward enough, you get something like that, barring some sort of technological change. So, I mean, in a sense, I just think objectively, right, they are more sophisticated. But if you think like socially, right, think of how different we are. We were talking before the show about Victorian mores. Think of how different we are from the Victorian period. Think of how different we are from 100 years ago, from, the sort of immediate aftermath of World War I. My God, we're a totally different culture. Imagine going back to that culture and saying, oh yeah, the first thing you've got, oh, this is my trans officer here. Well, the first thing you have to understand is that gender is a social construct. It's different than sex. And here are the different spectrums. They'd just be like, what the hell are you talking about? This is all I don't understand.
We've only just started to break down class barriers. We'll come to gender later.
Right. And I mean, and then you start talking about, and it's like, oh, here's my female officer with a nose ring, like, does she want to be a man? Does she isn't concerned about beauty? Where's her dress? It's like, no, she doesn't think this is ugly. This is part of her. Is that like what is going on? I mean, basic dumb shit would just be shocking. So I think that how would you even begin to explain that stuff? The terminology doesn't exist, and that's 100 years. Imagine the social, situation of not only a civilization that is, say, 10,000 years more advanced, but also made of protoplasm or whatever these guys are made of. Do they even have gender? Do they even have sex? We don't know anything about this.
Yeah, procreation might be a completely different. Well, and that drives a lot of how society works, isn't it? Really, this sort of the need for a society to continue is driven obviously by the need to procreate, and that's sort of how that need to survive. The lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy is obviously there to drive it. So it's all driven around that, really. So if that's different, then your culture's different, I suppose.
My lower hierarchy was always collecting Transformers toys, so I've been doing human wrong. I mean, it's very strange. But I do buy that, like, we would not be able to understand, and that we would seem, we would seem, we're animals. I mean, and we would seem as primitive as, depending on the society, as us going to some ants and saying, look, we have problems with the way you are conceptualizing hierarchy here. It's not entirely fair, we like you. We want to share some better anthill technology with you, but, you guys have some social justice issues you're going to have to work out.
It does, yeah. I do wonder about weirdly about these things, about true first contact. I as I said, recently read that book about the presidents and aliens and UFOs. It's fascinating, mostly garbage. But the concept of this first contact, and it's suggested in that book that it's already happened and all this other stuff. But as a species, or even as a planet, like you say, if a spaceship was to land, and I like there's always a phrase. There's like, if the spaceship was to land on the White House lawn, like they knew where they'd have to go, like they've got a GPS that tells them, but they could land anywhere. And then they say, like say, take me to your leader, wherever that is, whatever continent, whatever piece of land that is. It wouldn't unify us. It would create more barriers, because they'd be like, oh, they chose to land in Russia. Oh, they chose to land in North Africa. Oh, they chose to land wherever. Because they won't land on one of the islands. They're going to land on a large piece of land, wherever that is. And then beyond that, like you say, how does that impact on people's perceptions? And we're talking from a social construct. We're talking, obviously, we mentioned gender, but all these people with religious beliefs or their own personal beliefs, it would shatter that. Like you say, all of a sudden it's like, an alien species comes around and says, oh, you believe in a deity created all this? Yeah. All right, well, you're clearly not ready for what we're about to tell you, so we'll be back in a couple of thousand years.
Right. Well, think about how much, just physics has changed our understanding of the universe in the last 100 years. I mean, it is unimaginable how different we conceive of the universe. I did want to throw in a mention of Star Trek Enterprise, because you said, like, there's, you were talking about how it's either conflict or it's this sort of like prime directive thing. There is this sort of suggestion in Enterprise that, you see the first contact in Star Trek First Contact. And then Enterprise takes place like, 80 years later or something. And the idea is like, humans are kind of pissed off. And they're like, we're still on Earth. We've got this like prototype ship. You Vulcans keep visiting us, but you're not giving us your technology. And the Vulcans are like, yeah, you're not ready for it, right? We have this like civilization of logic, and we're trying to acculturate you slowly to it. But you still have guys out in the sticks who are, living on farms and are just like, these dirty Vulcans don't belong here, you know. You guys are a long way away from being ready to do what we're doing. And the humans are just like, yeah, we want that warp drive already. Well, they have the warp drive, but we want what you have. So, yeah, I mean, there's going to be that problem, right? First Contact isn't going to be like, I say isn't going to be. Well, I believe aliens exist, but it isn't going to be whenever, first of all, we're not going to necessarily recognize that species, know how to speak to them. If we can, we're going to have big cultural differences, and nobody's going to say, oh, you like the monolith? Well, here's your own to play with, you crazy apes.
Well, I suppose it's two things that sort of spring to mind is, we now have Space Force, not the comedy, but, the real thing. And to me, again, not to hammer home the American thing, because it's just unfortunate that you guys did it first. But it's determined as a military. It's determined as a branch of the military, which to me determines it as you say defense, but it's an offensive position to take. It says that says to the rest of the world and to whoever else, we now have a force that is directing weapons into space to protect us, and we feel that is the right thing to do. You go, okay, well, that's fine, but again, it's not about cooperation or collaboration. It's just finding another frontier in which to fight, really.
Well, I mean, that's been a point of contention for a long time, that, essentially until the Trump administration, it's been official U.S. policy and, in fact, international policy that space must not ever be militarized. And there have been rumors of, some sort of U.S. offensive weaponry, in orbit, but, there are secret military components to some of these shuttle flights, right, that are classified. We don't know what those refer to. It is worth mentioning that, not only are gravity weapons very cheap once you get them in orbit, but that it would be very simple with a high-powered laser positioned in around 6 geosynchronous satellites around the planet to essentially take down any satellite you wanted.
Yeah.
And there are rumors that other countries are doing this, that there is this, but whether those are true, I don't know. But for most of my life, certainly it's been the rule of thumb that space must not go down that direction. And I don't think we're prepared for it to do so. I don't think, we are overdue for another solar flare that essentially fries all of our technology. That is quite possible. That could happen tomorrow. We're overdue. We were overdue for a pandemic, and we all knew it was going to happen, and now it's happened.
Yeah. At
some point, we're going to have another solar flare, and we don't know how long that will set us back, but it certainly will have effects. What happens if there is a strike on our communication satellites, and all of a sudden cell phones don't work, GPS doesn't work? How much of our society, satellite TV doesn't work, for God's sake? I mean, what would we do? There would be mass confusion. So, yeah, I don't know that we're ready for even our own technology.
No, that's a good point. I mean, as it is, again, it comes to that thing of the technological curve, isn't it? The sort of the bell curve. The bell curve is the technical curve. It's exponential. It's going up. That at some point, we get to a point with technology where, and it happens with all of us, like you get handed a phone and a smartphone and you go, yeah, I get that. It's got apps on it. Hand it to my grandparents, and they're just like, it doesn't have a rotary thing on it. I can't call you. It doesn't work. It does now. Just stop doing what you're doing. No, it's true. I do wonder at times, and I've said that, I think you and I have had this conversation before. Like, if you and I have got certain technology on our phones, that's because it's commercially available. What is at the bleeding edge of technology that we have no idea about? Like, and how ready are we for that? And that sort of thing. Yeah, that's a good point. If it's taken away, though, I think we would panic. Take away sort of social media or like you say, and also like you say, we moved from television and stuff. We moved from analog to digital, several years ago, a number of years ago. If those satellites are gone and the analog's no longer working, you haven't got a backward pedal to go, right, in an emergency, we use this, because everyone's using, even radio. If I listen to the radio at all, if it's a podcast, whatever, I'm listening to it through my phone.
Right.
So I'm not listening to it through an AM and FM sort of situation. I'm listening through DAB. So, yeah, it would be very interesting if that was to happen. As Snake Plissken says at the end of Escape from LA, "Welcome to the rat race." And that it'd be back to that, wouldn't it? So yeah, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, I wonder how quickly we'd recover. I mean, you think about how many cars wouldn't function correctly.
Tesla would be screwed, wouldn't it? Let's be honest.
Well, but cars now don't have keys. They have an electronic start, right? I mean, it's you can't find a car these days that has a key. So that's not going to work. You can't. That means essentially all cars, but these old heaps. And if this happens 15 years from now, there's not going to be any cars that are functioning. You think about the disruption of the supply chains that happened during COVID. Well, all those supply chains are coordinated by computers and in many cases using advanced algorithms. What happens when you're just like, look, I'm pretty willing to bet you and I would not remember many phone numbers. A lot of people don't remember their own phone number.
Yeah.
So,
I think actually really we are going, not just COVID, but the Suez Canal incident that's happening now. You know, and it's one of those things you don't think about, or you don't even know that there is a very, very small, narrow strip of water, man-made, which makes up for apparently more than 3 or 4% of world trade routes.
Mm-hmm.
And this one ship has made a bit of a balls up, and it's become a crisis. If you lose all the technology, or I can guarantee a lot of those ships are relying on digital tracking information, digital communication devices, all that's gone. Yeah, all of a sudden you are driving a super tanker by what you can see out the window.
Yeah. Well, never mind the planes that fall out of the sky, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and then nobody's flying a plane. I mean, you have to replace everything. Yeah. I mean, this stuff will happen at some point.
Yeah. You're talking me into being one of those sort of crazy survivalists. I'm going to dig a bunker in my garden and fill it with guns and tinned fruit.
Yeah, my brother already's there. I mean, you know, if I could get up there, he has an AR, you know, and has you know, other stuff too, and has lots of food. When the pandemic hit, he stockpiled like 2 years worth of food on top of the like year he already had. So, you know.
Yeah. And again, you know, we've seen that people wouldn't cooperate. I don't think cooperation is in our nature at this point. I think there would be, you know, desperation. Moving on to a more sort of maybe more positive thought process. One of the things we talk about is this idea of the aliens communicating with us, or communicate in this film. It happens in loads of films. The aliens come down and they're able to communicate with us. I'm not sure if it was you or somebody else once made a comment to me about, well, you know, we see films we anthropomorphize an animal, you know, it's able to speak English. But if you were to truly take one of those animals and give them the ability to speak English, even then we would not be able to communicate, because their worldview and their list of experiences is so vastly different to ours that it's not a language barrier. It's actually, there's a whole load of barriers that goes with it. And it feels like the same with this film. Firstly, you know, I don't know how they learned to speak English, but this idea of them learning the language doesn't mean that they would be able to communicate or articulate ideas. As you sort of said, about the language would be different, the words wouldn't exist. Then there would be things where they would look at our language and you'd have to translate their communication methods to ours in order for them to be able to look at our language. And again, it's just taken for granted in films, but like, yeah, that's the other thing. If we have first contact, like, yeah, how do you communicate? I think Arrival is one of the best films for. And I love that film. This idea of how other beings would communicate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, usually you get around this with, like, in Star Trek, it's the universal translator. You know,
the psychic field of the TARDIS. Yeah.
Yes. But usually they don't even reference it, right?
Yeah.
Usually it's, you know, it's just forgotten, and it's like
once a season.
Oh, yeah.
It's once I find I watched a bit of I watched a lot of Doctor Who, but I started watching a lot of second Next Gen, Star Trek Next Generation. At least once a season, they'll just be like Universal Translator, and then we'll go, yeah, fine, carry on, and that's it till the next season.
But there are situations on Doctor Who where the TARDIS will literally be gone.
Yeah.
You know, it's been sent away because it's a plot problem to have the TARDIS there. You know, everybody still can understand everything, you know, because you forget about it. The end result is everyone speaks English. But I think you're right. I mean, I'm not sure how they understand. And, you know, I think that I found myself thinking about consciousness watching this film, and about the alien consciousness and how they would see us. You know, they're replicating our appearance, but you're talking about sort of like, how do you replicate the thought, not just the speech, but the thought. And yeah, maybe it makes sense that they speak slowly because they're putting together these thoughts and anything.
Yeah, well, it's funny because, again, you know, you can speak French. Yeah. Well, I would say, you know, fluently, you know, well, if anything, better than me, and I live next door to the French. You know, I have a basic concept, but even if I learn a language, to me, It's thoughts in English, translate the thoughts, verbalize it. And that causes a slowness. And, like, you know, you have to be incredibly fluent in a language, whatever the language is, to be able to. And I've met people that can do it. I know people that, when I was at university, I lived with a Portuguese girl that could. She obviously spoke Portuguese, but she spoke English fluently. And when she spoke with us, she thought in English. She said, I communicate with you and I think in that way. That, to me, is incredibly impressive. Like, that's miles beyond what I'm capable of doing in another language. And so it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of practice and stuff. And so, yeah, for them to be talking slowly, I suppose, makes sense. But also, like, what effort has gone into them translating the language to begin with?
Je rêve en français quelquefois. I dream in French sometimes. I find for me, I think in French when I'm having a French conversation, and I will look back and I will think, did I have that conversation in English or French? And I literally, it's like I'm in Paris and I'll be like, did that person shift to English? And I'll think, no, I must have had that in French. But there are words that I don't know, or an expression that I can't think of, where I'm stuck and and then it pulls me out of it, and then I'm thinking in English and doing the translation. But that takes, probably 10 years of working consistently, not just it being like an occasional hobby. It takes a long time. And even then it's not perfect. It's far from a native speaker. So yeah, I mean, you can come up with these devices like a universal translator or something that does it for you. But, the thing that I find is, I mean, translation is an art. And, in whether it's in French or in studying literature, you study translation and you understand that there's no such thing as a one-to-one translation. It just doesn't exist. Because even if you say the most obvious phrase, like I have 5 of that, well, what is the cultural significance of the number 5? It's different. If you have 5 fingers on your hand, 5 is something different than if you're an alien and you have 2 tentacles or 100 tentacles. You have a very different. There are lucky numbers. There are context, and that's the most obvious thing. Usually we have strange expressions about about things and how we understand concepts. Nobody is going to stop me. Try explaining the difference between nobody's going to stop me and anybody is going to stop me. You have to conceptualize a negative thing. How do you explain a double negative? I mean, these are nuances that it's very, I mean, how do you translate these things? And you're never making a one-to-one translation.
Yeah, which is when you get the fun of like Google Translate, when you see people put a sentence or something into Google Translate and then take it through 4 different languages, then put it back into its original language and it's come out completely different. And that's because it's literally taking the words and trying to do a one-to-one comparison and saying, well, I know that is that, and doesn't apply the context or the some of the other nuances that come with it.
It's fun. I work with international artists, and some of them have different levels of English, and occasionally you get sentences back where you say like, okay, I need to figure this out, right? And you're like, okay, that's not what he means, right? And so then you start figuring out, okay, what are the synonyms for that could have translated into that through Google Translate, right? And you start back, reverse engineering it.
I do that with some of the English. To be fair, I do that with some of the English people I know as well. So,
oh yeah, I mean, having taught freshman composition, the other thing is nothing teaches you how to speak a language because dictionaries are lies. The worst thing is, a student who says, well, that's the right word. It means what I'm saying it means because here's the dictionary definition. And you're like, Yeah, but you're using it in a context where we would never use it.
Mm.
It clearly has this other meaning. The dictionary hasn't captured that. We would never, technically it does mean that, but we would never use it in this context. It sounds really weird. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean what you
What are
think
the
it means.
three words that precede it? Sort of like, does it give it the same context? Is it in? What's the sentence it's followed by, and that sort of thing? It's nothing exists in that individual word. So yeah, and you're right about the consciousness as well. Like this idea of an alien having the same sort of linear consciousness as we would have. And it's fine, it works, and it's in most things. I mean, one of the few times that we do get this in, again, one of my touchstone references is like Lovecraft.
Mm-hmm.
Lovecraft in some of his stories is openly sort of saying, like, these things are so alien they don't care about us at all. But even in sort of some of the more lower smaller stories, there's moments where he crosses with an entity where they're like, oh no, like, you cannot understand the way this thing thinks,
Mm-hmm.
at all. That's totally true. I think he himself even in some used this analogy of sort of saying an ant to a person, like you do not have the same thought process. Like, it's not the same. So don't think that you would have the same thought process as something from outer space.
Yeah, I did find myself thinking of Lovecraft watching this, and I've gotten more into Lovecraft in the last year or so. And I did find myself thinking, especially the idea of this sort of cosmic horror, this sort of like reaction to their looks, because it's such a classic Lovecraftian cliche of people sort of like snap going crazy on a dime, right?
Yeah.
It's like the horror, and their brains just can't contain the old ones, and so I sort of felt there was a little bit of that of like, if you gaze upon the horror that is this alien, and they're not crazy, but they do seem shaken up for a while afterwards.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. There's a definite, and tentacles and numbers of eyes is definitely a Lovecraftian thing. But yeah, again, like I say, I like this idea of consciousness. It's not really played out in the film, but it would definitely play out, in a future version. And again, there was a sequel done to this in the late early 90s. I had a look on IMDb. I won't be watching it. It has less than 3. I think around 3 out of 10 on that. So I'm like, yeah, not going to get my time. But one of the things I've thought about as we've gone through, especially from the 50s, is could this work as a remake? If you were to take this concept now, could you do it again? And I think the film we did last week, When Worlds Collide, the science would have to change. We do it a lot, Armageddon, or even like recently Greenland. Like, we've tried to sort of address this idea of world devastation, and we just come up with different end results. And so that's why, sort of like thinking about this film, I thought, could they remake this film? Would it work today? And I think, you mentioned about the sort of Jordan Peele approach or some other. I think, yeah, you could. I think you just have to. You would just hit on some different themes. But I think this film could become incredibly important if it was to be remade in a clever way. What do you think?
No, I agree very much. I mean, I think it has to be done in a clever, artistic way, and let it breathe. But probably if it were done today, there would be a lot more focus on what's going on in that town socially, right? And this idea of sort of, I mean, we've had many remakes of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. They all reflect their time. This would have to sort of reflect, what it's like to have these aliens in human form wandering about the town, and how the town reacts to them as others or not. I mean, these are layers of meaning that we are accustomed to dealing with in one way or another that they weren't accustomed to dealing with in the 50s.
Yeah, and I think now, especially with, whether it be Islamophobia, or the fake caravans of people coming across the border in America, or the hundreds of people apparently swimming across the channel that Priti Patel wants to catch with nets. This idea of the fear of immigrants, or of countries, sovereign states, we are now a sovereign country like we weren't before. This idea of the sovereignty of a country being invaded, and this idea of the other. I think there's a lot. This film could really mind post-Trump, post-Brexit, and all that kind of thing. I think you could really do something with this film, and but you can. There's so much stuff. It's so prescient. Like this idea of the idea of escalation and militarization of a local police force. Like you don't need the military involved in this. Just a police force comes out fully kitted up and ready to start blowing aliens up. You're like, yeah, why? Well, we got it. We might as well use it. This idea of then. I like this idea of us not being ready to. Receive this information, and an alien going like, yeah, your planet's screwed up. We don't want to be here, and but then even begging, you could help us, make us better, and them saying no, we can't. You've got to deal with this yourselves. You can't be parented into this. I know I'd like to see that actually, a version of that that's done well. That's not just aliens come to Earth and we've got to beat them kind of thing.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that's how. I think that's sort of the Jordan Peele thing. I think you have to acknowledge just that different context in which we're aware of these issues. I also find myself thinking of colonization, although they're not here to colonize. I often think of there's an Alan Moore Future Shock in 2000 AD where aliens come and they offer. I think it's some random person, some amount of, alien cash or goods in exchange for the, swaths of the planet, sort of like buying Manhattan. And, this is up a vacation site here for our species. Yeah. So I find myself thinking about that and the need to trust, that message at the end of sort of not escalating, not perceiving an invasion where there isn't one. But it would be tricky because in a remake, you would have to try to navigate these issues without falling back on, like you said, the conservative cliches that we were talking about. Like, I'm going to get old Bessie, and this is America. Ain't no one come to America without evil intent, or just like some crazy cliche like that, while also being sensitive to obviously the analogs for the other or the immigrant.
Well, again, maybe you do it across the gender gap. Like you have the sheriff being an old boy, who's had that experience, who comes from that world of like you say that all immigrants are bad, or like holds those views, and maybe because of their life experience they do have that. They've lived through the Reagan era or all these others, and they've lived through whatever that sort of put that thought into them. Against make the scientist a lot younger. In fact, don't make them a scientist. Make them early 20s, teenager, maybe even just someone who's willing to stay. I don't want to say Greta Thunberg, but like that sort of thing of saying like, no, look, we represent the future, not you. Let us start to use. Let's forget the old ways, or let's at least try and be a bit more collaborative. Let's think to the future, and maybe have it a bit more. The last film, when Worlds Collide, we talked about its ideas, limited as they were, but about this idea of saving the future generations. And the ideas for the future. Take it down that route of having a much younger cast and sort of, and not kidify it. I don't mean Stranger Things kind of way, but I'm saying like just have it as a younger protagonist that's like, no, look, I've seen that we could. They don't want to. But E.T. did it. E.T.'s like that. Make friends. Have Elliot kind of maybe not a child, but I don't know. There's ways of doing it where you can address that idea of the generation gap as well. Of like, we don't have to rely on the old ways anymore. There are better ways of doing this.
Yeah, it's so tricky these days, though, because you'd have to make that town more diverse, right? The reality is the Southwest is, depending on the town, still predominantly white, but there are towns that are predominantly Hispanic, and certainly no place is that small and white. So it's a different context. So once you acknowledge that, if it's said in the present day, then you run into issues of like, well, you want people to come from different experiences, but you don't want them to be cliche. So you don't want like the primary, to have one Hispanic character who's like, my family came here, and we didn't have evil intent. Some people thought we had evil intent. It's like, oh, okay, there's that moralizing sort of cliche. Yeah, so I think it's very hard when you're talking about these issues of representation to get those right, which you'd have to do because the story is about that and fights that. And then people would say you're politicizing it. Good old. The original wasn't political at all. Yeah, and then we'd say, of course it is.
Yeah. I was going to say, we're going to politicize it. And you go, yes, but that's mostly what science fiction does at some level. Like everything. Yeah. I love that argument. The original one, what was it? Even sort of like, I've seen arguments of like Watchmen isn't political, or that like, like you say, 50 sci-fi isn't political. And you sort of go, really? Like, like you said, we had films like, when the Earth stood still. It's sort of like,
or Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And, all of it is, everything is political, and I don't know. I mean, I feel the same. Anything like don't blank, including don't sexualize it. Well, everything's already sexual. It might not be crudely tantalizing and whatnot, but there are, we're human beings. There are these layers to everything. We're political beings. We're sexual beings. Everything already is permeated by our psyches and all aspects of our psyches. You might object to the way it's done. Perfectly true. But, it was always already political.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, we'll wrap up and say, but maybe the way to do it is that you'd have to go to the extreme in really pushing some of those buttons. And so maybe, and again, I'm not, educated enough in some of these topics, but maybe I'd have to really hammer home this idea of the otherness and this idea of trust and really, this older generation that feels uncomfortable. Not just have it about race, have a trans character as the main protagonist. A character that's saying sort of like, just trust and collab and cooperate, not just across race, but across sort of like, gender and sexual orientation and everything. Sort of, I think, you really have to push some buttons to you really could as well. And I think it would be great, but it would be interesting.
I'm convinced that there is a whole bevy of science fiction that is yet to be produced, or certainly widely encountered, involving trans characters and using trans experience as a way of connecting, or the plot as a metaphor for that experience. I mean, here we have people changing shape. What is true? What is, in this case, they're truly an alien inside, but they're perceived a different way. What if they're stuck in human form? And it's like, you have to understand, I'm not a human. You're talking to me. You think I'm a human because you look at me and I have a human form to you, but I'm not human. I don't identify as human.
Yeah.
It's tricky.
It is, yeah. And just to clarify, because in case that got blurred, Julian wasn't declaring that trans people aren't human. It was just saying it was an alien experience.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I was trying to say it. That experience would be to validate one's interior identity.
I think. I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think I see some of these young creators that are coming through, and they have these different world experiences, and especially when it comes to LGBTQ and trans rights, and like there are some amazing stories to be told. I can't wait. Yeah, bring them on, because I've seen a lot of the same for 50 years, and I'm like, I want to see something new.
Absolutely, and new
So-
perspectives. I mean, look at what Jordan Peele has done. You
Yeah.
know, whether it's all a hit or not, it's definitely new and definitely vital.
Exactly, and I totally agree. Right, so we will wrap up there. We're going to just last final quick thoughts on this film, though, because I wasn't sure we'd get much out of this, but I think we have. But it came from outer space. So, what are your final thoughts then, as we wrap up on this film?
Good stuff. I mean, it is. Look, it's an hour-long Twilight Zone episode, and it, I think it's actually a good movie. It's not mind-blowing. It's not, the best movie ever. It's not a masterpiece, but it's a solid movie in a way that a lot of movies from this era are not. And it has a positive message that I think, is still important today.
No, I agree. As I said at the very beginning, this film was not what I was expecting, in the best possible way. It sort of starts with that, and I was like, okay, it's going to be, drive-in theater kind of B movie. Goes a very different way towards the end. Has a really interesting message for the time. There's stuff to talk about. I enjoyed this film. Is it going to go heavy? Is it going to come back into my rotation? Probably not. I don't know. I may end up watching it sometime in the future, but I recommend seeing it. I definitely recommend seeing this as a touch point of 50s sci-fi. I think it's been a really interesting watch.
I did want to say we forgot to mention this was originally produced in 3D, and so
Really?
I'm sure we both saw it So apparently this was originally produced in 3D, and it's an hour and 20 minutes, but remember, it's those days. It's got an intermission.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Wow. After 4 hours of the Snyder Cut, yeah, an hour and 20, I can do on my head. No worries. Right, we are going to carry on to the B movies. We're going to get into 50s monsters next. We've done sort of like big worlds. We've done aliens. Now we're going to do our first sort of like radioactive monsters with Them. 1954's Them, and Big Ants. And if I'm right, Clint Eastwood's first screen credit. So that's another one I've not really seen. So I'm really looking forward to get into this one. Heard a lot about it. So yeah, in the next episode, we're going to be talking about Them.
We've grown up with the movie poster, and
it's one of those I've seen stills from and the poster, and so again going in quite fresh. So really looking forward to that. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen,
at Times Space Pod.
Pod Time Space. Yeah, I've forgotten. Even that, Christ. Yeah, so if you want to come and talk to us, what your thoughts about this film? If you thought that it came from outer space, was worth revisiting, if you enjoyed it, if you want to go, you want to have thoughts or comment on it, come find us at Pod Time Space. Here, when I say it in flow, it works. At Pod Time Space, come and have a conversation with us, or about any of the films we've talked about, or any of the films we've got coming up. Talking about some of the our idea about humans. I think we will be probably revisiting this when we talk about The Man Who Fell to Earth, David Bowie, and that film. So, ladies and gentlemen, as always, thank you for listening. And Julian, it's been a blast as again.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Yeah, always a pleasure. This was a great conversation. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and we shall see you on the next episode.